Well, hello and welcome. I'm Mark, the vicar at St John's. This is week 2 of our slow walk through Isaiah chapter 40. As we do this, think less of a power walk, trying to cover as much ground as quickly as possible, and much more of a slow ramble, stopping to drink in the sights and scenery as we go. We saw verses 1 and 2 last week, that God's heart is to comfort his people, and the greatest comfort in life comes from knowing our sin has been forgiven. This week, verses 3 to 5. A voice of one calling, "In the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all the people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Well, chapter 39 concluded with the message that the mighty nation of Babylon is coming and the future of Judah, God's people, is in exile. But don't forget, that's not the last word, far from it. Because chapter 40, God reveals their future return from exile. That's what these verses refer to. And I think the purpose of this is for God to encourage his people to remain faithful through the tough times ahead. God is saying, your exile in Babylon will not be the end of the story. And the message of verses 3 to 5 is clear. Get ready to come home. So in view of this, I'm expecting verse 3 to say, in the wilderness, prepare a way for the people. But instead it's a way for the Lord. Again, in the next line, it's for our God. You see, the Lord is not just saying, come home and I'll meet you when you get here. But he himself will be the one to lead them home. Well, Babylon lay nearly 1,000 miles east of Jerusalem, and the direct route was very hard to travel. So people would instead travel way up to the north following the Euphrates River, and then back down south in order to get to the cities of the eastern Mediterranean, like Jerusalem. And so don't you just love the picture in verse 4? The Creator God will raise up those valleys that make the territory so hard to cross, lowering the mountains that are impossible to climb. Rough ground becoming level, rugged places a nice smooth plain. If you've played the board game Labyrinth before, it's all about trying to shift the pieces around to create routes through a maze. And this feels a bit like that moment when the pieces all line up nicely to create the path to where you want to go. Don't despair. The people needed to hear these words, that God will lead them home. Of course, this isn't a literal shifting of the landscape, but it's a metaphor that just as in judgment the Lord sends Babylon to capture his people, so it is the Lord who will open the way to bring them home. So don't despair. Even in exile, you are not abandoned by God. He is with you, and he will lead the way home. Well, I want to build in a bit more of the context of Isaiah at this point. We're going to flick briefly back to chapter 1 because the book begins by describing God's people in pretty bleak and dire ways as a sinful nation, corrupt and in rebellion, forsaken the Lord. They've turned their backs on him. It was clearly a time in their history where you can just imagine any reference to the Lord among them being erased, any teachings about his ways being mocked and overwritten by their own corrupt practices. And then verses 21 to 26 of the opening chapter spell it out in such a way that has led to the book of Isaiah being called a tale of two cities. I've just highlighted the bookends of this section for us to see. The faithful city has become a prostitute. Well, pretty extreme language, but that's how far things had fallen in their relationship with God. Verse 24, where they've become God's foes, his enemies. And God's judgment through the exile will come to purge, but also to restore. And so that remarkable promise of verse 26, afterwards you will be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Well, the message of chapters 1 to 39 of Isaiah is largely rebuke, and rightly so. But then we hit chapter 40, and the message becomes not rebuke, but comfort. Comfort my people, speak tenderly to them. God promises once exile is over, he will restore them and bring them home. They will become the faithful city once more. Well, the picture in chapter 1 is that Jerusalem is corrupt. Jerusalem has forsaken the Lord. Jerusalem has become a prostitute. And so it's astonishing how the Lord should desire to speak tenderly to Jerusalem when we get to chapter 40 to comfort her, to say it's going to be all right. I will restore you. I will bring you home. You can almost hear the wise parents in these words of comfort, can't you? The one who has lovingly disciplined his or her child, but now stoops down and looks him in the eyes, wiping away the tears and saying, it's going to be all right. Well, chapter 40 begins this story of how the faithful city that has become faithless will become faithful again. And this will happen through the outworking of verses 3 to 5, which is, for them then, as God rescues his people from exile, and for us now, as God rescues us through Jesus. Well, we have a few minutes, and we're just going to complete the big picture story here. So back to verses 3 to 5. These verses begin with a voice. And I think this voice is the Lord, but his message is then to be echoed by his prophets, firstly by Isaiah in his time, but then later, as Matthew 3 and Mark 1 explain, by John the Baptist, who was to prepare the way for Jesus to come into the world to rescue his people. He would be this voice. So how will a faithful people that has become faithless become faithful again? Well, it's through Jesus. Well, our verses for this week then end with the glory of the Lord revealed. His glory is revealed as he rescues his people and brings them home. Again, these words point to Jesus. His glory revealed as he comes into the world, and his glory shines brightest at the cross, where he dies to rescue his people. And then when Jesus returns, well, then every eye will see him and every knee bow before him. Back in verse 5, all the people will see it together. How will a faithful people that has become faithless become faithful again? Well, as Jesus comes and dies, and one day will return. Well, Revelation chapter 21, right at the end of the Bible, paints the picture of a new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, not as a prostitute. Well, this is the city made faithful once again. They will be his people, we read, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Well, what's the purpose of this picture of the future given for us today at the end of the Bible? Well, this promise is from God to encourage his people to remain faithful, even through the tough times.